I think the first thing that we have to understand is that the way that spirituality is discussed in the West now, I think is deeply flawed and is not really grounded in reality. There was a guy called Plato around 3,000 years ago who wrote a lot of books about these things, and his ideas came to be taken up um, by by the Abrahamic religions and ultimately Christianity, and that has become the foundation in many respects of Western culture. So basically stuck with some ideas which were flawed, have been the foundation of Western culture. And one of those flawed thinkings is that there is this distinction between the physical body, if you like, and the spiritual. There's this idea that these things are two separate domains. And there's almost this idea that if anything falls in the category of spiritual, it must therefore be disconnected from reality. And I think that is just completely flawed thing. I started thinking about spirituality and realizing that it was important to explain. Then I started to sort of drill down and ask unconventional find the answers. And one of the questions that I asked was, when did this thing arise in human beings, right? If we accept this evolutionary chain that goes back from the Homo sapiens, Homo heidelbergensis, Homo erectus, ultimately Homo habilis 3 years ago, where along the line did spirituality arise, and does it in apes and our other, like pygmy chimps and the species that are closest to us? Okay, and so my research into that has basically shown that spirituality basically erupted onto the scene in human beings around 70,000 years ago. Okay, so it existed probably in some sort of a nascent form prior to that, but Homo sapiens have been around for around 300,000 years. And for most of that time, the evidence found by the archaeologists shows that there was very little progress in things like tools and for what they could determine of cultural practices. But around 70,000 years ago, in a period referred to as the cognitive revolution, the anthropologists find that there was this explosion of innovation and creativity in the design of tools. Okay, this is where the first archery arrowheads show up. Archery's building bows and arrows is extremely complex if what you're previously building was a stick with a stone attached to the end.
And I would imagine these people were doing it alone too. They didn't have the benefit of telephones or prior knowledge. They actually had to think all the time. So in a certain sense, they're thinking more than we were.
Right. That's right. And if you, so let me just stay with that for a moment and just come to that point. So 70,000 years ago, something happened to human beings. All right. And that thing that happened was this cognitive, they call it the cognitive revolution. That's a term, that's one term for it. Okay. And what the evidence shows is that from 70,000 years, there was this explosion in innovation in tool making, okay, including arrowheads, okay, which indicates archery, which indicates that they went from something very basic to something very complex, practically overnight in the record. But that was also accompanied by the cave art. So art is in there, and it was also accompanied by funerary practices. So they started to find that from this point on, that when they found bodies that had been, the bodies had been buried with rituals, with artifacts and so forth. So something happened in the human mind 70,000 years ago, 70,000 years ago, that basically was an explosion of cognition, to use an example. And in my reading of it, that is not only rational as per the ability to develop new tools, but it's also artistic and it's also spiritual. And it's all of these things are together. And we make these sort of artificial distinctions between rational and spiritual and artistic. And we give these names to things that help us understand the thing, But in reality, it's all one thing. It all came from the same place. It's all interlinked and it's all intertwined. And with respect to the spiritual part of it, we all have it. Everyone has a spirituality. That's simply a feature of being a human being. Okay, so if you think about a dog, which has got this absolutely crazy sense of smell, I don't know whether dogs have got spirituality. If they do, they have dog spirituality.
Right.
But the point is that within the human central nervous system is this capacity to sense and to feel and to ask questions and to seek answers to big questions that can't be answered
Right.
through
That
science
can't be
and
answered. Right.
such as where did we come from, what happens when we die, and what the hell are we actually doing here in the first place? Big questions. These fall within the realm of what we call spirituality. So in my investigations into these things, I've been trying to find a way to explain that simply. And in the little book that you can get on the website, vitasapien.org, there's a link there to Vita Worldview. So Vita Worldview is kind of like the little philosophy book. You can download it for free as a PDF.
If somebody's watching here, could go to your site and download that then.
Yeah. Okay. Yeah. You can get it right now. It's Vita, VITA Sapien, SAPIEN.org. There's a link to Worldview. Okay. You can get the PDF, and it's a short book. I started writing it in 2022, and every 6 months or so, I did a big update on it. And so it's actually kind of really, it's matured now.
Okay.
And it basically takes this whole philosophy that I'm talking about, puts it into a book that takes about an hour and a half to read. One section in there is called the New Spiritual Framework. And what I try to do is I try to take this word spirituality that makes people pull their hair out and get confused. Right. And I sort of break it down and I say, this thing is an umbrella concept that shelters many themes. Here are the 6 core themes. Okay. And one of those core themes are the big questions. Why are we here? These are spiritual questions. But one of the other things I call it the bigger thing, and that basically is another aspect of spirituality, is this identifying yourself as part of something greater. This idea of seeing yourselves not just as like an individual unit in a substrate, actually identifying yourself as part of this bigger thing. Now, what happened from Plato onwards was they took this thing that was tightly interconnected, reality and spirituality, and they split it in 2 different directions. Okay. And they said the spiritual thing over here is disconnected from reality, which is why most spiritual and religious traditions are batshit crazy and make no sense whatsoever.
Because they've separated themselves.
Because Plato separated it, and the early Christians took that on board. Not just the Christians, the Jewish traditions and the Islamic traditions as well. Right. Okay. And so what you've now got in the West, where you've got New Age spirituality. New Age spirituality is basically like a sort of hodgepodge of different bits and pieces from traditional religions, plus a whole bunch of other stuff thrown in, a few UFOs, and like Yetis.
And, I was just going to say that.
Yeah, Yetis.
Exactly, was on my mind.
Stay with the Yeti. We'll stay with the Yeti theme. So New Age spirituality similarly has this disconnection from reality. If you go into crystal shops, which I'm sure you've got in America, that's what I call them, places where they sell New Age spiritual supplies. Right. You'll buy sage, you'll buy crystals. Okay, incense. You won't find incense. Yeah, plastic Buddha statues.
Right.
Okay, you might find pendants in there one day. Okay. Yeah. Okay, but you won't find science books. Right. And indeed, I actually went into a crystal shop on the Sunshine Coast with one of my books, which is about climate change and spirituality. Okay, and I asked the woman if she'd lodge it, and she said, "Oh no, this is environmental science here. We don't do that here." Right. So there is this separation in mainstream Western culture's thinking that spirituality and rationality and reality as 2 separate things. And that explains why most spiritual traditions are simply batshit crazy. Okay. So I just want to come back to this point. So this thing evolved in Homo sapiens around 70,000 years ago, the cognitive revolution, and in Africa probably.
Right.
And then the Homo sapiens, with this new way of seeing the world, had a much better way of interacting with the environment and with each other. They had, okay, and so they were more successful, and they basically took over. It became the dominant tribe, if you like, to use an expression. They eventually found their way into Europe, and when they arrived in Europe, which is 40,000 years ago, we now know them as the Cro-Magnon people. All right, and the Cro-Magnon people were in Europe for 30,000 years over a couple of glaciation cycles, and when the ice receded, then we entered what the geologists refer to as the Holocene epoch, this very stable period, last 12,000 years of very stable climatic conditions that allowed agriculture to spawn. It was the beginning of the Holocene that we no longer refer to those people as Cro-Magnon, and that's when you go into like your Bronze Age cultures and later on your Iron Age cultures and so forth. So in my narrative around spirituality, I use the Cro-Magnon people as a frame of reference to help us understand who we are as human beings before we had all of the layers of mainstream religion and New Age spirituality and politics and national borders and technology and busy lives. Who are we at the bottom of all of these things? If you could strip away all of the fabricated stuff, who are we at the base? And I had this extraordinary experience. I was in France in 2022 on this spiritual retreat, which is kind of batshit crazy in itself. But I found that we were actually an hour and a half away from a place called La Salle 4. La Salle 4 is named after La Salle, which is famous for a cave that these young boys found in 1940, which was a cave full of cave art painted by the Cro-Magnon people around 70,000 years ago. If you just type in La Salle Cave, LASCAU cave, all right, and go to Google Images, you'll just see this cave has two 80-meter long chambers. It's very low. You can sort of jump up and touch the roof, and it's only about 2.5 meters wide. But the actual upper section of the cave in this long column is made of a particular mineral, a rock, that holds color really well. So when they painted it with these natural pigments, 17,500 years later, it's just vibrant.
Wow.
Okay, so the original cave got so many tourists that all of the moisture in their breath started to grow fungus on the cave. So they shut that down. But they ran a machine through, this special laser machine, and they got a perfect replica. They manufactured a perfect replica of the original cave. And I went into this perfect replica. It's called La Salle 4.
That wasn't a repair of the actual coloring. You're saying a replica, meaning it was something, a copy of it, so to speak, correct?
A manufactured copy that they built into
because I didn't want anybody to think they were just using a laser to obliterate any of the
no. They used the laser to create a 3D map of the original cave, and then they had the team of artists using the same minerals. They paint the same animals on the wall. And if you actually look at the photo of the real one and the photo of the artificial one, these things are near indistinguishable, right? Okay, so they've built the International Center of Parietal Art. Parietal art is cave art, and they've got this artificial cave, this replica cave, La Salle 4, built inside it. And so me and a couple of these guys were on this spiritual retreat thing, went into this place. And when you step into the cave, you actually go up in this big glass elevator to the roof, and they take you into this room, and you watch this little video for 10 minutes about how they found the cave. And then you step outside, and you're on the roof of this big architect-designed concrete building. It's fucking freezing because it's the middle of winter in France. And then you step in through this really nondescript door. You go 4 paces forward and like down some steps, and bang, it hits you. And I started... I was just crying It
Right.
just came over me
What you're seeing.
because for the first time, I kind of got in contact with who I was as a human being without all of the layers of bullshit and
Mm.
politics and
Right.
religion and okay, and it was extremely powerful for me.
And was it?
And I'm
Would you
like,
say it was definitely an unconscious thing, though, right? I mean that's your unconscious. It's connecting with something that you wouldn't think about. I
yeah,
assume, right?
yeah. The other three, I was with three other guys, and they didn't have that same emotional response that I had. But
Mm.
for me, it was extremely powerful, and I just stood there, just in absolute awe. And this is how I've come to the philosophy that I've written, which is called the Vita Sapien philosophy. Vita Sapien is Latin for life wise. Basically, it's a life wise philosophy. Okay, is deeply influenced by that instance, but also by just my learning about the Cro-Magnon people. And what I wanted to say about Cro-Magnons with respect to spirituality, okay, is they didn't have that separation that came in three three 3,000 years ago. Okay, they didn't have that separation, that artificial separation between reality and spirituality, right? And so we have an insight into their spirituality by looking at what they painted in those caves,
Right.
right? And they painted in the caves the Cro-Magnon of that period. Okay, this was the Magdalenian period of the Cro-Magnon time frame. their primary food their primary meat food was reindeer. Okay. And yet within this cave where there were 900 individual animal pictures, there was not one. I think there might have been one reindeer. All
Hmm.
right. They weren't painting the menu, right? They were painting the animals that were beyond the menu. These were the animals that were fast and were powerful and were awesome. They had the mammoth in there. They had the woolly rhinoceros.
Hmm.
They had the auroch. They had the there was all of the animals, right, were painted heading into the cave, with the exception of the horses, which were painted heading out of the cave.
Hmm.
Something's going on,
Right.
right? And these were the animals which were like revered, if you like. Now, here's pragmatic spirituality in the cave, in the fire pits, which is where they do the communal cooking, right? They there was lots of reindeer, of course, that was the main fare, but there was occasionally you'd actually find the bones of these sacred animals
Oh,
that were
really?
painted in
Hmm.
the cave, because they weren't above actually eating the creatures that they regarded as sacred, right?
Hmm.
Talk about pragmatic spirituality.
Right.
And so this is what we've lost. And the other thing is, so since say 70,000 years ago, up until around about 3,500 years ago, which is the period called the Axial Age, which is when all of this batshit crazy thinking about spirituality went totally off the rails. When all of the major religions were founded, or the ideas, Plato, for example, um, was in this period called the Axial Age. So this is 2,800 to 2,300 years ago. In that period, this is when all the major religions came up. So Buddhism
Hmm.
came out of this period, Hinduism came out of this period. Plato was writing in this period that later went on to become the Abrahamic religions. Judaism came out of this
Hmm.
period. Um, Stoicism came out of this period. Taoism came out of this period. It's called the Axial Age. So
Hmm.
imagine you go from 70,000 years ago up to, say, 3,000 years ago. You got
Right.
67,000 years of human beings being these cognitive, spiritual people. For nearly 96% of that time, our spirituality was engaged with nature,
Right.
with wildlife, with forests, with seasons, with rivers, like the physical interaction with the living planet. That's what we've lost. That's what has been taken away from us by Plato and all this muddle headed thinking. And that's what I'm trying to recreate in modern Western people. It's like a neo indigenous spirituality, if you like. Indigenous people today, those individuals who still practice culture, right, have got what I'm talking about, right? They never lost it. I mean, it was brutally murdered and raped out of them by the colonialists, right? But in Australia, like, there's a very strong indigenous culture still. Like, that's the word
Are
they
you
use,
talking about referring
practicing
to the
culture.
Aborigines or?
Yeah, I'm talking about the Aborigines in Australia, but I'm talking about indigenous people around the
The
world. So
world
the
in general, right?
Maori and right. Okay, so they've still got what the Cro-Magnon had. And I just find it much easier to talk about these things using the Cro-Magnon as the example, as opposed to the Indigenous Australians. Because if I were to be telling this story with respect to the Indigenous Australians, I'd be talking about people that already exist, and I'm not in the game of telling their story, if you
Right.
like. And okay, and also what I'm talking about is indigeneity, if you like, rather than a particular indigenous tribe or nation. And so I use the Cro-Magnon people as the frame of reference for this spiritual worldview, um, and basically saying that their spirituality was completely grounded in reality, right? And secondly, it was grounded in nature, right? And that's what and having lost that in the West is what allowed us to go and do the atrocities that we've done to indigenous people and to the living planet. And that is the heart of the climate and ecological crisis. So having identified that as the heart of the climate and ecological crisis, you can then start to see the solution to that is to help re-engage people back into a spirituality which is engaged with nature and engaged with the reality of nature. Okay. And that's really at the heart of the work that I'm doing.